Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. Happy New Year and welcome to the first Musawah webinar of 2021 and the 7th webinar in our knowledge building series. We're so happy that you could join us for what promises today to be a really inspiring discussion about incorporating ideas of goodness and beauty into our lives and in our families. And I think this is a message that we really have to hear right now. It's especially important today. My name is Jana Rumminger. I'm a member of the Musawah's Knowledge Building Working Group, and I will be the housekeeper for today's event. And with this series of webinars, we are trying to open new digital spaces for building and sharing feminist knowledge on family relations. The topics revolve around diverse, plural, and flexible understandings of marriage practices, of laws, of norms, and of ideas in Muslim contexts. You can watch all of our webinars on Musawah's YouTube channel. And before I hand the mic over to our moderator and our speaker and discussant, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items, which you will see on the screen. The webinar is also being live streamed via Musawah's Facebook page, and a recording will be made available on our YouTube channel. The participants who have joined us on Zoom may ask us questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We usually have too many questions to address, so if we don't get to your question today, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us via the email address that is on the screen now. In the chat box, we will be sharing resources and any reference materials that the speakers refer to. And we'll also share these on Facebook and on our website afterwards, so you'll have a record of them. But we ask you to please do not use the chat function for asking questions. Use the Q&A function for that. And only use the chat function if you're experiencing technical difficulties. And you can message me directly and then I will be able to assist you. And finally, if you're tweeting or posting about the webinar, please don't hesitate to tag us at Musawah on Twitter and at Musawah Movement on Facebook and Instagram. And now let me introduce you to our moderator, Ms. Sarah Marsso. Sarah is a graduate of Sciences Po in European Studies and International Relations, and she also holds an MA in Development and Cooperation in the Middle East and North Africa. Since 2015, she has been the knowledge building coordinator in Musawah, and she is an invaluable member of the knowledge building working group. She has researched and co-authored several Musawah publications, and she plays a key role in all of Musawah's knowledge building and capacity building and movement building work. And in addition to her work in Musawah, she's been involved in various workshops, activities, and events relating to feminist and anti-racism activism in France. And I will now pass it over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana, and thank you for the generous introduction. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to wish each and every one of you a happy new year. May it bring us closer to the divine light, strengthen us in that which is right, and enable us to live justly and beautifully on this earth. As we embark on this new journey, we're thrilled and honored to have with us two inspiring women, scholar activist Amira Abou-Taleb and Faeeza Vaid, for a conversation on ethics of Ihsan. And we hope this webinar will open our hearts to the unexpected beauties of the Qur'an that heighten our awareness of God and its attributes of justice, goodness, beauty in our daily lives and in particular within our families. So 2020 was a challenging year for many of us. It was a year of crisis, of grief, of distance, mental, physical breakdowns. It really pushed us to reflect individually and collectively about the meanings of life and the meanings of humanness. And many of us experience and are still experiencing profound feelings of anxiety, of fear, insecurity, and then we're seeking sources of comfort and hope. And from a faith-based perspective, some of us find this hope and the sources of comfort in the remembrance of the divine or a higher force. أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ. By Allah, remembrance, the hearts set a rest. This remembrance, this dhikr happens in prayers, in all sorts of meditation, but also in the reasoning with the Qur'an. And Allah says in Surah Muhammad, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَثْقَالُهَا. Then do they not reflect upon the Qur'an, or are there locks upon their hearts? How do we unlock our hearts? How do we liberate them from the ugliness, the injustices, and violence of this world? The Qur'an acknowledges our weaknesses, but at the same time, it gives us the path towards healing. So it's our prerogative, our duty, our right to engage in the Quranic process of meaning making, even if in the past centuries it has been dominated by men and by patriarchal voices. How can the ethical teachings of the Qur'an help us to pursue this life based on justice and equality? These questions are at the core of Musawah's knowledge building work and of our research initiative, Reclaiming Adl and Ihsan in Muslim Marriages Between Ethics and Law. We see this research project as a conversation with you all where we can reclaim the beauty and the justice of our tradition, but also explore how they can be reflected in our social norms and our lived realities. And how do we do that? By rethinking and reclaiming these key concepts from our tradition, which are adl and ihsan, and which we understand as values of transformative justice and equality, and also values of beauty, goodness, and care. The first 5 webinars looked at marriage from a fiqh, legal, and sunnah perspective. But today we have the chance and honor to have with us Amira Abou-Taleb to delve into the Qur'an and its ethical worldview to explore the function and meaning of ihsan in relation to gender, family, and community dynamics. And we're very grateful and lucky to have with us Amira in this research initiative. Her contribution is also joining 4 other scholars of Qur'an who will be featured in the next webinars, Asma al-Murabet, Umayma Abu Bakr, Nur Rufia, and Mulki al-Sharmani, who are all proposing to reimagine Muslim norms and gender and family relations through a perspective that is grounded in Quranic ethics. And in doing so, they're then making the case for centering Quranic ethics in the interpretation of the verses, but also to bridge the gaps between this important ethics and the norms that shape our contemporary family relations. Amira Abou-Taleb is focusing on ihsan and what she defines as the Quranic mandate for beauty and goodness. She will share with us today why is it a central concept in the Quranic ethical worldview and how it is relevant to marriage and to the larger family, even expanding to the society. I have to say that I personally found Amira's work very enriching and groundbreaking, and I'm super excited and looking forward for her sharing today. So without further ado, let me briefly introduce Amira, and you have access to her full bio in our website. Following a career as an international advertising executive, Amira went back to school to earn an MA in Islamic Studies from the American University in Cairo. Upon graduation, she designed a new course titled Beauty and Reason in the Islamic Civilization, which she introduced and taught at IUC. She also introduced this course at the University of Helsinki, where she is currently working on her doctoral study, focusing on the concept of ihsan in the Quranic ethical worldview. Amira also authored a chapter in the newly released book edited by Nevin Reda and Yasmin Amin, and I really advise you to look at this wonderful book, which my colleague Jana is now sharing the reference in the chat. And we are honored to have with us today an inspiring activist, Faeeza Vaid, who has been with Musawah since the very early beginnings and is amongst the pioneers working on Muslim women's issues in the UK. Faeeza has an academic background in law and religious studies, and in 2011, she became the executive director of the Amazing Muslim Women Network in the UK. In the 2019 Queen's New Year's Honours, Faeeza was awarded an MBE for services to women's rights. So again, we're very lucky to have with us today a force for social change and someone with an extensive knowledge and dedication to Muslim women's issues in the UK. We all look forward to an exciting discussion before us. Welcome, Amira, welcome, Faeeza, and welcome to all of you. And now let's begin with my first question to Amira. So this past year and its multiple crises reminded us of how fragile life can be, while at the same time it made us increasingly aware of the existing structural injustices. But the Qur'an warns us against breaking the harmony of the creation. It's calling us to stand for justice, to seek beauty. This is where your research is critical, Amira, because you're arguing for the need to rethink and understand Islam through a Quranic ethical standpoint and with a focus on the concept of ihsan. Can I start by asking you first, what made you embark on this study?
Thank you, Sarah, for this profound introduction that you had, setting the stage about the Quran, and for inviting me here. I'm very glad to be here. I want to thank you and honored to be part of this Musawah initiative, and thanking everybody in Musawah who's behind the scenes now and working on this, very professional and doing everything with love, which I think is beautiful. I also want to thank everybody who's attending, whether attending now live or in the future watching this recording. Thank you for making the effort and taking the time to listen to what I have to say. So going to your question about what made me start on this, I feel like I'm a bit mystified about this disharmony between thoughts and many of our thoughts and actions or sayings. And when I say we, I don't mean to generalize everybody in the world, of course, but I'm talking about generally people would like to see a world and to live in a world that is more beautiful and is more good. Yet there's so much ugliness in the state of the world that we live in today. And I think having come out of 2020 and in 2021, we see how the entire universe seems to be aching for something different. Now the state of ugliness happens in terms of things that are as, you know, horrible as terrorism, and also things as simple as just propagating negative stereotypes and living in countries where the laws still don't regard the woman as a fully equal human being that has exactly same equal rights in marriage, for example, and divorce situations. So this disconnect I felt was disheartening. And speaking as someone of faith, I felt like we need divine light, we need guidance to go back and try to understand how to access more beauty and more goodness. And so it led me back to the Quran, the source. There would be no Islam if there was no Quran. And when I started thinking about that, I started thinking about when you say Islam, my guess would be around the world that beauty would not be the very first word that people think, you know. And I started looking and I realized that we have such a wealthy and rich tradition, scholarly tradition, yet most of that tradition has been focused on jurisprudence and ahkam and legalities. But when you actually look at the Quran itself, you find that over 90% of the verses do not relate to legal issues or ahkam. Some people say that the legal verses are less than 1% of the Quran. That makes me, not just me, but many other scholars over time, and particularly in this recent scholarship, try to shift towards a focus on Islamic ethics and Quranic ethics and the Quranic worldview, and to kind of explore beyond, you know, or along with what the legal work does. And when I started looking at that and thinking about ethics, the concept of ihsan really struck me. First of all, when you think about the God's attributes in the Quran, they are referred to as Asma'ullah al-Husna. And that is at the root, the same root of the word ihsan, as I will explain. And that for me was very interesting to think that God's attributes combined all represent beauty and goodness. But then there's also a very famous hadith, and actually a hadith that has established the 5 pillars of Islam. And in that hadith, the Prophet is asked to define Islam and Iman and Ihsan. And he describes Islam as the 5 pillars, Shahada and fasting and praying and those. And he describes Iman as belief in God and the day after and angels. But then when he's asked to define Ihsan, the Prophet says, it is to act as if you are in seeing God. And if you do not see God, then you know that God can see you. So this for me was quite magnanimous, this idea of being in the presence of God. And that would be, you know, if you knew that, that would be what ihsan is. So I wanted to explore that root in the Quran and kind of delve into kind of an extensive study about the root of that word and how it is present in the Quran.
Thank you, Amira, for this very enlightening response and highlighting the value and power of spiritual beauty in our tradition, which unfortunately is often taken for granted and not really paid enough attention. And this very important hadith that you mentioned that is predominant in our Muslim cultures, but that ask also this question of what does it entail to act with ihsan. And that's where your study is groundbreaking, because in your research you've developed a methodology to examine the meanings and function of this concept of ihsan in the Quran. So could you please tell us why is ihsan so central among all the other ethical principles, and what is the methodology that you've developed to reach this conclusion?
Thank you. Allow me to share my screen. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, well, first, my work is based on the root, the Arabic root, the word hasun, and most Arabic words are start with a triliteral root. And husn, when you look at the meaning, it involves beauty and goodness combined. And the derivatives of this root, such as ihsan, muhsinin, ahsinu, husna, all carry that same original meaning of beauty and goodness. And that term or that root appears 194 times in the Quran. So in my doctoral studies, I've developed this systematic and holistic approach along with my brilliant supervisor, Mulki Sharmani. And this approach is built on investigating that root throughout the entire Quran. So looking at the 194 occurrences and creating a database where I contextualize each and every occurrence within the context of the verses that are surrounding it in the surah and across the ethical worldview of the Quran itself. Once I do that, I started looking at some common themes where there are many occurrences. And once I identified the theme, I start conducting a hermeneutical and linguistic analysis of the occurrences within that particular theme. And after that, I start looking at major tafsir works. I've chosen 9 seminal tafsir works. And what I try to do is I try to look at that to try to evaluate the opportunities. What are in these works? Because we have an extremely rich tradition that we can bring to the forefront, that we can highlight, that talks about this concept of beauty and goodness. But I also want to look at what has not been said and what can we maybe highlight that needs to be considered. So that's as far as the methodology is concerned. Now, as far as the themes, one major theme is universal harmony. And this is something that I have been finding out through my research. And what I mean by universal harmony, I mean that this notion of beauty and goodness embedded in husn and ihsan are markers of creation itself in the Quran. So let me share with you some examples, not all examples, but in Surah 23, in verse 14, it says, فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ. So here, this notion of beauty and goodness denotes God, God being the utmost beauty and the utmost goodness. In Surah 39, verse 23, it also describes the message that God has sent, Allahu nazzala ahsan al-hadith. So ahsan here is also considered a superlative of both beauty and goodness. So, but then in Surah 32, the term ahsan here defines the act of creation itself. And for those of you who are interested in linguistics, even though the term ahsan seems very similar to the 2 previous ahsans that I just put up, it's very different grammatically, because here it's a verb. And verb means an action. And this means that the act of creation itself is an act of beautifying and making good. And this is how creation came into being. Finally, I wanted to emphasize also that the Quran emphasizes the human creation. In Surah 95, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. Now, this means that the human being is created in the most beautiful and most good fashion. And these are not any standard translations that I am using. It's just kind of loose translation of the meaning here. Now, tafsirs differ on what taqweem might entail. Some say that it means that the human being can stand on 2 feet as opposed to animals that walk on all 4s. Some say, no, this is about the human intellect, that the person has a mind versus others, created beings. Some say, no, it's a spiritual enlightenment. We can debate that. But what we do know is that the Quran emphasizes the human being with this notion of beauty and goodness as part of a general harmonious existence. And if I ask you to think about that and think about how beauty is part of intrinsic in our human nature, I would ask you to take a second and think of something beautiful, anything. It could be something in nature, it could be the face of a loved one, it could be a kind word. I'll give you a second, just think of something. And now, I apologize ahead of time, but I want you to think of something ugly, something that that you consider ugly. It could be a pile of trash. It could be domestic abuse. It could be whatever you might. So think for a second about something that you would consider ugly. Now, I just want you to spend the following second inside your own self and see which direction are you more swayed towards. Which direction is calling upon you. And I think that we as human beings are inclined to search for beauty and to find comfort and solace in beauty and in goodness. And by goodness, I mean acts of goodness, which could be acts of kindness. It could be goodness in terms of skill, excellence in doing something. Is that striving for perfection that is only obviously attained by God, but striving towards that. So when we think about that, we could think about why it is often relaxing for many people to be amidst nature, regardless of what nature you like, if it's being by the seaside or being in greenery or even in the desert. There's a soothing effect to that. And that's part of this harmonious, universal order that I am talking about. But now that the Quran has defined this beauty and goodness as part of, innate to creation, there's a mandate for reciprocity. Now, many of you might know that the Quran also signals out the human being as being God's Khalifa on earth, as being the agent on earth. And in Surah 28, and I'm forgive me, I'm not saying the entire verse, I'm just saying the part that I'm concerned with here just because of time constraints. But here it says, وَأَحْسِنْ كَمَا أَحْسَنَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ وَلَا تَبْغِي الْفَسَادَ فِي الْأَرْضِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. And what is this saying? It's saying that manifest the beauty and goodness that have been manifested into you. This is the mandate. This is the human mandate. And on one end of the scale, there is manifesting beauty and goodness. And in this verse, it shows you that at the opposite end, the extreme opposite, is to manifest corruption. Corruption means things that are imbalanced and unjust, unfair. To visualize it a little bit, you could see it as a scale with fasad, corruption, transgression, inequality, injustice at the bottom end, and this aim for elevation, towards beauty and goodness at the very top. Now, many people would agree that the standard in the middle would be basic justice, basic equality, basic fairness. And if we look at the Quran in Surah 16, there is a very clear and stern divine mandate that says, Inna Allahu ya'muru bil-'adli wal-ihsan. So here there is this very solid relationship between justice and ihsan. And it's almost as if there's a hierarchy where justice is the very basic building block of human relationships. But because we are talking about the divine guidance, okay, and that is true of all religions, or most religions that I have been reading about, that there is a call for something higher. And that doesn't mean that you marginalize justice, but it means that you bring justice to the core and fulfill that. So then you can aim to manifest what is higher than that, which is ihsan. I hope that answers the question a bit.
Thank you, Amira. Actually, you've opened so many windows through which we can appreciate and impact these meanings of ihsan. And in fact, your research is really challenging the very idea that beauty and goodness are taken for granted, or just ideals to be kept aside for poetry, for example. And I like this verse that you mentioned from Surah An-Nahl that really make this relationship between justice and ihsan and show that it is the prerequisite, the foundation that we need to be able to move to the next step, to aspire for beauty. But unfortunately, it's a shame that when it comes to gender relations and our family relations, many of us living in Muslim contexts, we are still struggling with this very basic foundation of justice in order to be able to aspire to this higher goal. So that leads me to my next question, Amira. Applying your methodology, what are the implications of this Quranic mandate for ihsan when it comes to gender and family relations?
Okay, let me share with you some of the research that I have done so far. And it is, in any society, family is usually the building block of society. And the way I wanted to illustrate that, again, is through a visual by showing that, the nafs is obviously at the core because the Quran addresses the believer, the person themselves. But then there are verses that we will talk about that shows that وَخَلَقْنَا لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا, that you are partnered with someone. And there is then the procreation, there is offspring, and then there is that very interesting relationship between offspring and parents. But then the circle expands to include extended family and dhul qurba. And I'm using here words that, terms from the Quran. And then there is those who maybe lack family, and those are the orphans, or maybe the vulnerable in society. And I will try to address each one of those briefly, some more extensively than the others. But all of these combines represent what I call concentric circles of society. And what I am arguing is that this notion of ihsan lies at the very center of this entire build-up or this entire construct. So let me share with you a little bit more depth about what I'm talking about. At the very basic unit is the couplehood. And this chapter in Surah 30 and verse 21, the Quran says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُم مَّوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. Now, what I'm trying to establish here is that in the Quran establishes the partnership relationship between a spectrum of mawadda and rahma, and making the objective, and this lam in Arabic, it's a causation. So it's the reason for this union is to find tranquility, is to find comfort and peace. Now let's look at the spectrum of mawadda wa rahma. What I call here, a relationship spectrum. And this is what the Quran establishes. But if we start looking into multidisciplinary studies, and if we look into particularly psychological studies, we'll find that this notion of love, of mawadda, is often an intrinsic feeling. It's something that just happens often spontaneous. And it's not only between couples, but it's also between parents and offsprings, and sometimes between friends and people that you care about and people that you love. And one of the definitions of love is that it's a state of selflessness, is where the person derives their own pleasure from the joy of the beloved. Okay? Now, I realize that not all partnerships are like that, okay? And there is this spectrum, and they're not mutually exclusive. But there's also this other end of the spectrum, which is about rahmah, which is about compassion, empathy, feeling for someone else. And again, this is here, it's in the concept of couplehood, but this is also exists in all human relationships. So if I were to make a distinction between those two, I would say that the first one is more instinctive and spontaneous, while the second one is intentional and requires effort. Now, how does ihsan relate to this? Ihsan is through my study, I realized that the context of ihsan, at least in those themes that I'm talking to you about, it shows that it mandates intention and it requires effort. And the Quran commands ihsan, particularly at the most difficult of times. And this reminds me of a post that Dr. Umayma Abu Bakr had posted maybe a year or even not more before that. And she was looking at the term Jamal or Jamil in the Quran. And I remember in her post, she said that it was very interesting to see that it's connected with hardship. And that kind of stayed with me. And when I was doing my own research, I realized it's the same situation, that ihsan is being commanded, not when it's convenient, not when it's nice to be, feeling good and you want to do a charitable act. No, but it's mandated at the most difficult of times. So how does that apply in marriage? Well, I think many of us would agree that one of the most difficult times in marriage is when it's on the brink of a divorce. So in Surah Al-Baqarah, there is this verse, الطلاق مرتان في إمساك بمعروف أو تسريح بإحسان. Now, if we contemplate a little bit here, we realize that there is a relationship that is quite turbulent, that there has been contemplation of divorce or maybe actual divorce twice. And this means that this couple have been oscillating between a desire to remain in the marriage and the impossibility of actually doing so. So what's very interesting here, and I call upon all of us to think together about this, is that the verse mandates that if you stay together, then you do so in what is commonly known to be good of ma'ruf. But if you decide that you can no longer live together and you are going to part ways, this is when the injunction of putting forth whatever is more beautiful, whatever is more good, thinking about the other with that sense of intention and empathy and putting that out there. And this is very important, particularly that married couples might cease to be married, but when it comes to parents, they continue to be parents. And parting in what is beautiful and good is very important. And when you think about that, and you think about the laws and legal systems in many Muslim countries today, we're still fighting at the level of basic equality. That a woman should not get divorced, be informed that she's been divorced without her knowledge, for example. And this is one of the laws that exists in many Muslim countries, unfortunately. So here in Surah An-Nisa, it's a situation, again, that is kind of turbulent, that there's alienation. And in this verse, it says that it's better to try to reconcile. Okay? But then the verse ends with إِن تَحْسِنُوا وَتَتَّقُوا فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ خَبِيرٌ. That regardless, and it doesn't say you only tahsinu in case you stay together or in case you separate. It's a general term. This is how relationships should function. Even if the relationships are not fulfilling their original role of providing sakina and comfort, and there is impossibility in living together, even in that separation and in that disconnection, there has to be some sense of beauty and goodness. So that's a little bit about the marital relationship. But then let's talk about parent and offspring relationships, again with that relationship spectrum between the love, okay, and the concept of doing what intentionally is more beautiful and what is more good. Now, here it's a picture of a little infant, and subhanAllah, one of the mysteries of this world is that without, the caregiver's care, an infant will not be able to survive. They cannot feed themselves, they cannot change themselves, so they need that. And oftentimes, in most cases, parents are endowed with this natural and intrinsic sense of love that they take care of their children. They want their children to be, pleased and to live happy. Now, I do realize that we cannot generalize and that there are many cases where there are neglectful parents, but I am talking about the general norm. Now, when you think about the parent as they get older, the situation is a little bit different because the adult offspring here, it is not, yes, everybody maybe, or let's not say everybody again, but most people care about their older parents. But studies have shown that taking care of an elderly parent is a very difficult task. It's a very consuming task that comes with a lot of tension. And this is the point that the Quran mandates ihsan. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but in this, for example, Surah وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ إِحْسَانًا حَمَلَتْهُ أُمُّهُ كَرْهًا, and it talks about the role of the mother. In this verse, it says وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, and talks about not only one showing ihsan to one parent, but to both of them. And then it adds فَلَا تَقُلَ لَهُمَا أُفٌّ وَلَا تَنْهَرْهُمَا وَقُلْ لَهُمَا قَوْلًا كَرِيمًا, that even when you are providing this caregiving, this is not only the physical caregiving, it's not maintaining them or offering shelter or hygiene. There is another level of, and this is very interesting, particularly as old people sometimes tend to forget or have dementia. And can you imagine how difficult that is to deal with? Even on the very basic conversational level, maybe repeating something 15 times over and being asked the same question. So here the Quran is saying that even within that, you have to almost humiliate yourself and humble yourself, because this is how this reciprocity is. And it says at the end, كَمَا رَبَّيَانِي صَغِيرًا. So in the many verses that the Quran talks about بِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, in 5 verses that I've listed here, this command comes immediately after the command of Tawheed. If you believe in God, if you believe in the oneness of God, then you have to show, parents ihsan. There's only one occasion where this is not the case, and that's in chapter 29 or Surah 29, where it says that even if your parents try to dissuade you from belief, you still show them ihsan. Now, as a summary, quick summary, the emphasis on the parent-offspring relationship here, or offspring-parent relationship, are 3 important points that I think need to be highlighted. One is the role of the mother. Now, we have to think about the Quran over 1400 years ago being revealed in an extremely patriarchal society where the male progeny is really the only thing that is considered. And the father is, it's part of that entire patriarchal system that was prevalent at the time. Still, patriarchy is obviously very prevalent, but maybe in a little bit of a different way. So by the Quran bringing forth the role of the mother and saying how crucial this role is, it's affirming this notion of gender equality, that the both parents, and when I say both parents, it's despite the fact that the Quran emphasizes the role of the mother, it consistently says وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. So using this muthanna or the dualism shows that the father is involved in this act of parenting. And this is something that we need to be thinking about today, because as we talk about patriarchy and toxic masculinity, that affects men as well. It's not only about women. And men, should not be denied this access to having, a very active role in fatherhood. And there's also an emphasis on emotional wellness, on the psychological well-being, on how you speak. And I think that these are very important things that should allow us to kind of take a step back and think about how this universal harmony is manifested through the layers of society in the way we deal with people. But then we could ask about, what about those that don't have immediate family support? There are people who, everybody comes from parents, obviously, but not everybody has children. So what happens in that case? What happens to orphans? What happens to people that are vulnerable, who might not have support? So here, and also in many cases in the Quran, it says, وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا وَذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينِ وَقُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا. Now, this is a very important verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, which Niveen Rida says is kind of a skeleton of the entire Quran. And in it, it establishes this notion of starting with the parent, to show them beauty and goodness. But then it also includes the extended family. And we know that this nuclear family structure, some people argue that it's a modern manifestation, that it wasn't like that. So I'm here highlighting the different levels of relationships, human relationships, that the Quran speaks of. And there's many more in other verses that I'm not bringing. So the extended family, dhul qurba, the aunts, the uncles, the cousins, those that are related, and close to you, but might not have somebody to take care of them, that there needs to be, or maybe even if they do, still having that extended family connection adds to that whole notion of tranquility that we were talking about before. And then there is the yatama and the masakin. But before I get to that very quickly, I want to point out وَقُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا, that the Quran describes these concentric layers of society to ensure that everybody has a support network that tries to manifest and put forth what is beautiful and good. But again, this should not only be limited to financial support or physical care. قُولُوا لِلنَّاسِ حُسْنًا. لِلنَّاسِ is people at large. When you speak in a way that promotes beauty and goodness. And I'll end with this slide here that talks about al-yatim and al-miskin. Al-yatim is the orphan. And al-miskin is a very interesting term because it means that those who are vulnerable. It doesn't have an exact translation in English, but vulnerability can happen for many, many reasons. And it could be financial vulnerability, but it could also be emotional and psychological and mental vulnerability. And there are people like that who might be shunned from society. And it is calling upon believers that just like you have that relationship between the original couple between love and rahmah, mawadda and rahmah, that should extend throughout all of the layers to include all of society and to encompass those who might not have the families, to support them. And in doing so, it ensures that that entire concentric circle of society, then society is built of all these different concentric circles, like creating this huge Venn diagram that creates the community and the world at large and everybody. So I feel like ihsan is very much at the core of all our relationships, and even maybe beyond human beings, but that's not the focus of what we're talking about now.
Wow, this is absolutely beautiful. Thank you, Amira, for uncovering this interdependent relational system in concentric circles. You've shed light on a very important aspect of ihsan, that it requires attention and effort, and that's why the Quran commends ihsan in challenging and most turbulent times. You also showed that we need to act upon seeking ihsan, especially in these difficult situations like in divorce or complex relationship between aging parents and children. But all this can also have a bitter taste when you are someone who is in an abusive situation. and leads us to ask the question of on whom falls the responsibility of ihsan. For example, when a woman is experiencing domestic violence, and when in our culture she's often asked to be patient, to bear with that. But in fact, as you've shown, if you think of ihsan as an individual and a collective right, and its ripple effect on all of those who are marginalized and abused in society, it becomes empowering, because it leads us to convince ourselves that we all have the rights to live a beautiful, fair, and equal relationship, and that we shouldn't accept the ugliness and injustices. So my last question, Amira, is taking us back to the ground. Could you please tell us what are the reasons behind this disconnect between our social and legal norms that discriminate against women and this call for beauty and for justice, and how this is related to the difference between ethics and laws? Because we know that law can't deal with ambiguity, abstract ideas, but it is still informed by ethics. And in our context, these ethics are often inspired by our tradition. So could you share with us what are the implications of your very important research on multidimensional reform work?
That's a huge question. I can answer from my perspective and shed light on some maybe of the reasons. And I think that maybe we could divide that into one, which is a communal, group effort, and one is an individual. On the communal group effort, I feel like there is a lot of reliance on laws that need to fulfill this role of justice and fairness and equality. But we also have to realize that laws are dynamic. The community produces laws. And when this notion of fiqh and the schools of fiqh were established, in the 2nd and 3rd century Hijri, they responded to the needs of the community back then. Now you have to realize, historically speaking, that the Qur'an until the death of the Prophet was limited to a Bedouin society of Mecca and Medina and their outskirts. Now this is a very small community, as a very patriarchal community, but a small community nevertheless. Now, within a couple of decades after the Prophet's death, you suddenly have an Islamic empire that now has to rule over regions that are very different, and regions that are extremely culturally and ideologically rich, like modern day Iran and Iraq and that Persian empire and Egypt. Now you're bringing in languages, religions, traditions that are extremely different. So what happened in the, in the Umayyad and the Abbasid more era was that there was this struggle to try to create an empire, to rule an empire. It was more of a power dynamic of trying to establish laws. And because it is under the umbrella of Islam, they tried to decipher the Quran based on how they understood the verses and what met the needs of the society back then. So being a very patriarchal society, it's very interesting to me when I look at the analysis and I look at some seminal works such as Al-Tabari or Zamakhshari or Al-Razi, and these are famous tafsir works of the earlier period. And you look at how they dealt with this notion of ihsan. And when they dealt with it in the context of marriage, for example, like tasrihun bi ihsan or an tahsinu, the discussion was very patriarchal. They didn't realize ihsan or look at it from an ethical worldview of the Quran. It's a very atomistic approach, verse by verse. So we're not looking at ihsan in the Quran. We are looking in this verse, what does ihsan mean? And there's no reference necessarily to the concept of beauty or goodness, but it's a very practical mandate. That this means that when you divorce, and it's always only talking to men, when you divorce your wife, you try to do so in a way that is amicable, you pay her. And what is this amicable way is defined by paying her rights, not bad-mouthing her, not ruining her reputation. And it has really nothing about this notion of beauty. Yet the same mufassirin, when they talk about bilwalidayn ihsanan, they talk about this notion of beauty and how you need to be kind and how you need to have rahmah and how you need to, that this is a level beyond even mere justice. So it's very important to realize that as a community in today's world, that we need to honor the tradition. We need to honor the tradition because these people have invested an incredible intellectual feat and a spiritual one to try to bring the Quran to their lived realities. And in doing so, they've established a methodology of how to derive laws. And I'm going to use probably a very naive analogy, but if we were to think about algebra, go back to elementary school or whenever you took algebra, if you took it, they taught us equations. And there's the quadratic equation, for example. And in that equation, it said these are the formulas. You plug in these numbers, and say, for example, you looked at the quadratic equation in 7th grade, and you remember that you worked really hard on one of the problems, and the answer was 36, for example. Okay. So today you have these formulae, in place that you need to plug in the different variables. The world is not the same world that it was 1200 years ago. But oftentimes what I'm noticing is that when we think about the quadratic formula in this analogy, we only think of the answer 36. That's doing the tradition a disfavor, a dishonor, because they've invested a lot of time and effort to try to create a methodology. So, and humanity, as is mentioned in the Qur'an, it's a progression. And the Qur'an has so many parables of societies, rise and fall of civilizations. So there is a progression that happens. And if we only limit ourselves to the conclusions that we reached in a very different context hundreds of years ago, then we are denying ourselves, this privilege of moving forward. Back then, and not even back then, till not long ago, our ancestors, my ancestors, your ancestors, and not far off ancestors were involved in slavery. I bet you everyone here, their grandparents or great-grandparents at some point maybe were slaves or enslaved or owned slaves or were involved in that. Doesn't mean they were evil people. It means that at that time, this was acceptable. It is no longer acceptable. And everybody can understand that. Okay? Not everybody, again, most people hopefully can understand that. So we need to bring this divine guidance to today's world. We need to understand that we create the laws. We need to fix the laws in a way that gives women full rights as human beings, particularly in family laws, because that's where we see the greatest disharmony and this distinction between, especially, in Muslim majority countries. So this is on the general end. But then on the individual element, the Quran addresses the human beings, addresses people, and particularly those who believe in the message of the Quran, and places the responsibility on the individual. Okay? Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan is very important. It doesn't say to all of you collectively, so it relieves the burden off of you, Sarah, or off of you, Faeeza, or off of me, Amira. No, it talks to every single person that you are the agent and you need to manifest that. So we need to stop pretending like it's not our responsibility. It is our responsibility, in my opinion, as individuals, not only to fight for gender justice, but to fight for what is beautiful and what is good for both men and women. And I think when we think about this, this issue of the imbalance and the unfairness, yes, oftentimes it affects women, of course, and particularly in domestic abuse and horrendous situations like that. But this cannot be good for men either. And I think that when we think about beauty and goodness, we have to think about it as salvation for all of humanity, and allowing beauty to take its central role as a main tenet of this divine message. And I'm sure many divine messages. I think this is, it's just the same message being repeated and repeated and repeated. And this is what the Quran talks about. It's the same message that is revealed over and over again. And this is a message about not only fulfilling justice, but it is ensuring that and moving even further to put forth whatever is more beautiful and more good. So by accepting domestic abuse, for example, you are accepting the ugly. And this is, in my opinion, seems to be counter, productive to what the actual Quran is saying. So I think that if we bring back this, create a dominant discourse around beauty and around goodness in everything. And it could be something that, of course, needs to be fixed on an infrastructure level in laws, at least to achieve justice. But when we talk about beauty on a personal level, it's talking about thinking about that consciously, being aware, putting yourself in the seat of the observer and saying, yes, I am going to, even as simple as having a little plant on your table, just noticing that miracle of, that beauty in front of us, and even in our little, the cup that you drink in, just adding beauty, making it central, and not thinking of love as a bad 4-letter word. It's a beautiful word, and we need to start shifting the focus, in my opinion, about grounding that as central themes of and part of the Quranic ethical worldview. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Amira, really for ending with this very powerful response and highlighting the need to read, to understand our tradition through today's social circumstances. And that's why it's important for this research to happen in conversation with the context, with the lived realities of today's Muslims. Thank you also for reminding us of the multiple dimensions that takes a transformative change. It happens at all levels, starting from the individuals. And from a faith-based perspective, you've highlighted why it is so important, because we're agents of Ihsan, and it's our responsibility to fight for what's just and beautiful. But also for highlighting that it's important to also challenge the dominant patriarchal and authoritarian discourse and create one that cherishes beauty, goodness, and justice in everything. Thank you, Amira, really for your research and for your sharing today. To our listeners, we will have some times for question and answers in about 20 minutes. So please type your questions through the Q&A box, and if relevant, address them to Amira and Faeeza. And now let's hear from our dear Faeeza, who will reflect on some of the issues shared by Amira and how this relates to her activism and research and work in the UK. Thank you, Faeeza, for honoring us with your presence today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's afternoon here, so good afternoon. Firstly, thanks to Musawah for inviting me to join this incredible discussion. Amira, it's been a privilege to hear you speak, and in preparing for today and reconnecting and hearing you speak today, I have felt my soul be really nourished with the reminders of Ihsan. And also the reminder of this movement, the strength of this movement. Before I tell you about my work, and I believe that Zul will be sharing some screens for me, I just wanted to share with you all a little about my journey with Musawah. Just give me one sec. So I joined the Muslim Women's Network UK as a volunteer in 2008. Zul, you can go to the next slide. And within a few months, I had the opportunity to attend a residential short course here in the UK. It was called Gender, Advocacy and Islam. And the course was coordinated by Zaina, Ziba, and the late Cassandra Beltran of Musawah and the early MWN UK team. And we only have one photograph from that course, which tells you how long ago it was, because now we'd have 100 for every event we attend. The year before that, I had spent a year at the Religious Studies Department at the University of Cape Town under the tutelage of Dr. Sadia Sheikh, where she introduced me to the term Islamic feminism. And for those of you who don't know the work of Sadia Sheikh, I suggest you find her and check her out. When I returned to the UK, I was seriously disappointed, as I could not find an organization who was working on gender justice within Islam. And the Islamic studies academics I met weren't quite up to speed either. So as I was completing my master's in laws, I became hugely fascinated by the concept of authority within the Islamic legal tradition, and particularly its impact on Muslim marriages and divorce. And for those of you who are familiar with the work of Musawah, you'll know that this initial course was, and the work of Musawah was a match made in heaven for me. You know, we talk about match made in heaven in marriages, but Musawah was potentially, my first love affair. Finally, there were people asking the same questions and positing some really interesting answers which made sense, because the things I was reading in books, Islamic books and otherwise, didn't quite make sense to me and what I was seeing in the lived realities around me. I then attended Musawah's short course in Malaysia a couple of years later, And since then, have been putting what I learned from Musawah into action through the work at the Muslim Women's Network UK. So if you go into the next slide, this is just some details about MWN UK. If we fast forward 13 years, we are now an award-winning, groundbreaking national charity in the UK, which is probably still the only women's organization which proudly calls itself Islamic feminist, and have tried to reclaim that term, as you all have across the world. One of the next slide, sorry, Zul. One of the things we have tried to do, like Musawah, is to share knowledge, to distribute knowledge. And our website contains a whole host of resources, from our reports, information booklets, our consultations, and our resources have been downloaded now over 155,000 times. So they are being read. Women are seeking knowledge. And I think there's definitely, 13 years later, more appetite for this type of work. One of the things, if we go into the next slide, please. One of the things that we've recently launched is called the MWN Hub. And this is really a space for women to connect and share issues. So I would suggest checking it out when you do have a chance. And in terms of what we do in the UK, our work is grounded by research, and what we try and do is advocacy and influence. So on the next slide, you will see that in October of 2020, we launched something called the APPG on Muslim women, which is connected to the UK government and is particularly looking at the issues affecting Muslim women. And our first area of research will look at Muslim women's experiences of maternal care in the UK, with a look to addressing and improving the services that are here. I'm now going to tell you a little bit about the Muslim Women's Network helpline, which is on the next slide. And we started this project in 2015 after we continually received call after call after call from Muslim women asking for information and advice about their rights. And we realized that the need was definitely greater, and we needed to create a particular service. So what we created was a specialist faith and culturally sensitive service, which again provides information, advice, support, and refers Muslim women onto specialist services if they need. It's a national service. And in our first year, we helped just over 355 individuals. In 2019, that number had gone up to 1,247. And no doubt, 2020 was our busiest year. So over the years, we have helped over 5,000 individuals. And that in itself is no mean feat. And we can talk about what some of the learnings that we have had from the service. Just on the final slide that I'm going to share, the breakdown of the calls that we receive obviously fluctuate year to year, but our top 5 issues have always been our top 5 issues. So domestic abuse, mental health issues, divorce, marriage and divorce queries, questions around housing and homelessness, so the interconnectedness between finance and security and the vulnerability a Muslim woman may find herself in, and more generally, relationships. So essentially what I'm saying is that on a daily basis, the Muslim Women's Network UK deal directly with the worst of what is happening in Muslim families in the UK. And this is in a context in the UK where ethics is often established in other institutions like the law, like UK law. And it's interesting that despite this, we will still have Muslim women come to us asking for a religious divorce, where to get a religious divorce, even when divorce is available to them under UK law. And I think that's something potentially, Amira, we can discuss. That, why is it that, where do Muslims go to when they need support? Where do they go to when they need support? I also wanted to highlight that in terms of domestic abuse, and we're all very familiar with domestic abuse as an issue, often it exists between partners, However, it can include abuse by other members of the family. So for example, last year, we received a contact from a young woman still living with her family. She was in her 20s, who was regularly beaten physically by her brother. He used his fists against her when she did anything he would consider unacceptable. And these errors would include not cleaning the house well enough. In terms of marriage and divorce, like I've said, we received many requests for information and better understanding on the rights of within a marriage and the rights of women in terms of divorce. And that is our most downloaded resource. I'll give you an example also. In one case, a woman contacted us because after 20 years of marriage, she wanted a divorce. Her marriage, this was not something new. Her marriage had included many trials, including physical abuse, emotional abuse. But at this point, even 20 years later, her husband was not willing to accept her divorce request. And this woman said to us, "My husband will kill me, and he is capable of killing me, especially when I leave him." Then we have cases where honor-based abuse is ripe. So this could include forced marriage, the risk of refusing a forced marriage, what happens when you're in a forced marriage and you want to leave a forced marriage, and other issues like this. I'm going to stop sharing the slides for now, if that's okay, because essentially what I am seeing is, I was really grateful, Amira, for reminding us about the concentric circles, because essentially the concentric circles for me demonstrate the intersections of relationships and connect to our ongoing responsibilities to one another. And for me, it's clear that if the ethics of ihsan and adl are present at all of these levels in each circle, then society as a whole would thrive, as its foundation would be support and care. That's the best case scenario, right? But essentially what I'm seeing is the worst case scenarios. So what happens when adl and justice do not exist, or exist in a limited capacity at a circle level? What is required, I guess, Amira, I'm asking, is what is required to bridge that void? So, the examples I gave would be included in that. But, for example, what if a parent neglects or harms or abuses their child? Sadly, these cases are not uncommon across the world. Or what if there is forced marriage or FGM or, divorce, issues or abuse and things that we've spoken about? These harms are clearly a contravention of the parental ethical duty, of ihsan being involved in that relationship. So then what's the expectation on the child thereafter to then reciprocate and fulfill their duties to their parents? What happens when there's a break in the circle? So that's my first question. And then I'll give you my others, and then hopefully we can go into a discussion. In your paper that I've had the privilege of reading, there are a number of examples where you've referenced the scholars, and you spoke about this in your presentation, who accepted and used the term ihsan, but did little to explore or define its meaning further. And you've touched on the context, the patriarchal context, and the limitation of them as human beings ultimately. I really want to know why there hasn't been a challenge on this approach up until now, and what can we do to spur that on? Because I'm really interested in this reclaiming the ethics. And I guess what I heard also from Sarah's final question is that we all have a duty to be upstanders of ethics, not to be bystanders, to take responsibility. And for me and the work of the Muslim Women's Network, part of that reclaiming and part of that, taking a stand is by saying no to the ugly, by making sure women know that they don't have to put up with the examples I've given you and the 5,000 more that I could give you. So I'll stop there because I think that gives us enough space to at least start a discussion. but I feel like we could be here all day potentially.
Faeeza, what you are doing is incredible. I salute you, bless you. I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of everyone who's watching this now and who will ever watch this recording. Honestly, I think what you're doing is at the core of what we are all now trying to say, whether it's through Musawah or through, my paper or the papers of my mentors, or I think that a couple of things come to mind. First is this idea of looking at the tradition and challenging the patriarchal ideals. I think that is important, but I wouldn't use the word challenge because they are not here forcing it on us today. These people created this hundreds of years ago. Okay, I would rather use the term build up. Let's look at this intellectual tradition and bring it to the forefront in terms of the intellectual feat and involve our minds and our, souls and be involved also spiritually in it and try to put ourselves in their shoes. They were very much a product of their environment. So the problem is with today's people who choose to, remember that the analogy I gave of the quadratic equation, they choose to look at the 36 and not the actual formula and not plug in the variables. So I think to kind of move forward and pay honor to this very intellectually rich tradition and spiritually rich tradition is to build upon it by doing it on two levels. And here, if I may, I'll just bring in my advertising background. Oftentimes when companies, try to sell a product, they have a strategy of what's called like push and pull. And by push, they means that they go to the supermarkets and say, we want you to put our product in the most obvious, at eye level and the shelf. Or now with the internet, you want them to open up and this would be the first thing that comes up when they click detergent, whatever it might be. So that's pushing the brand itself or the product itself through the people that are selling it. But then the pull factor is to the end consumer by making ads pop up that make me absolutely want to go and wash my dress with this brand, So these two things have to happen, and we need to adopt this type of mentality when we talk about this. The problem is that oftentimes we have grown to believe that religion is taboo. And I feel like this is at the core of the problem. The religion, if we want to live as spiritually enlightened human beings, religion has to be at the core. We have to have access to it. I'm not saying that anybody should go in and come up with a fatwa, of course not. But I'm saying that we have to reclaim our responsibility as individuals. And the Quran speaks repeatedly about this call upon human beings, about the reader to contemplate, to think, to reflect, to discern. So there is an individual responsibility. So I think,
Amira, I think that's a really great reminder, and it may seem really obvious to you, but I think for me that is the most important point here, to be conscious about our faith and to really reclaim it. And I think, when you started answering the question, there is unfortunately still in our communities this misnomer that the tradition is untouchable and that it's there and we have no right to even disagree. We shouldn't disagree, and unfortunately that's not a healthy place to be in.
Because they're thinking of the mentality that you're challenging the tradition. What I'm saying is let's not present it as a challenge to the tradition. Let's present it as an honor to tradition. You can't live with a tradition if it's going to strangle you. I mean, eventually what's going to happen, and this is happening, that people are moving away from religion, and not only away from Islam, that, the numbers, and I have looked at statistics of people who are claiming non-religion is exponentially growing. Yet at the same time, people have that spiritual need. So what you will find is that more and more people are moving to yoga, to meditation. And these are brilliant ways to get in touch with this universal harmony. But what I am saying is that we can access that also through the Quran. It's not exclusive. You can find, other ways to look into it and to honor the tradition. I think the fear is that this concern that if you do not follow exactly what the traditions say, is that you're discounting the tradition. And I think that's a very naive way of looking at it. So what I'm saying about this push and pull is this idea that let's increase this talk, this conversation about beauty and goodness to make it the dominant discourse. This would be the push, that somebody who's in that relationship that is abusive, when they go to the mosque, they don't hear the words that are, no, just you have to tolerate, and ihsan is for you to, just find that within you to accept and tolerate. In my opinion, that would be the opposite. You are not only accepting a status of ugly, but you are also projecting that to the women around you in the community. The more women, who live and agree to live in circumstances like that, the more, if they're establishing the norm. So I think on the one hand, the dominant discourse, and eventually it should be in mosques and on media, platforms, that there is, when you think of Islam, that there is beauty and goodness at the core. I think that's the push. But at the pull factor is works like what you are doing, is the helpline, is to say, no, this is not right, this is not acceptable. But also not to be discouraged, because as human beings, there will always be good and there will always be evil. As believers, I believe that the role as this agent upon earth is to try to push more room for the beautiful and the good, but not to think that we are gonna, in our lifetime or in our children's or grandchildren's, that there's gonna be a time where we're gonna, eliminate all evil. And I think that's unpractical to think of.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I mean, I think that's super helpful to just hear that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amira. Thank you, Faeeza, also for you very powerful sharing and sharing what you're doing with the Muslim Women Network UK. And I invite all our audience to check the resources that Jana has been sharing in the chat, and check your publications on the website, which are very helpful in taking actually this knowledge out of this ivory tower to how can it be practiced on the ground. I'm sorry to interrupt this very fascinating conversation, but we also have a lot of wonderful questions that have been sent by our audience. And I would like to start that now so that you can also continue on the conversation addressing their questions. So my first question would be for Amira. So the question says, have you noted any particular relationship between ihsan and other Quranic ethical concepts? And if so, can you reflect on that? More generally, how may other Quranic ethical concepts be relevant to this kind of project that you are undertaking?
I think this is a very important question, because again, I think part of us presenting work that is robust is to make it holistic. And by making it holistic, it doesn't mean that any one individual has to look at the entire text with all the concepts in it. But it's like building, a puzzle that is about beauty and goodness and about all the other ethical terms. So there are very powerful terms in the Quran like taqwa and ma'ruf. And these are very important, and they are often found in conjunction and in relationship with each other. And most of the Quranic verses or stories kind of end with a call upon conjuring and discerning and reflecting upon those very key ethical terms. Now, as an individual, I am very focused on working on ihsan. But then there is the incredible work of, like I said, Asma al-Amrabit and Umayma Abu Bakr and Mulki Sharmani and others who are working on other concepts. And I think that this is all building pieces. My piece is very small, their piece is much bigger. And eventually we create this new image and this new truth. And it's not new, actually, it's just there, but we are just uncovering or trying to bring it to the light. So I think that hopefully this edited volume that will be published by Musawah will have not only my little ihsan piece, but will have many more. And together, it will represent a much bigger part of the pie.
Yeah, thank you, Amira. And also to inform our listeners, we hope, inshallah, that this volume will be published by the end of the year. So check our website and we will inform you, inshallah, when this is up. The second question is for Faeeza. How do you see promoting a new understanding of Quranic ethics as part of your advocacy work to deal with gender inequality and abuse? Would that work? How would it work? And who would do this work?
Lots of questions. I think I'll start with Amira's point that it's not new. And I think that is the biggest hook that we can have in our communities, that what we are speaking about is not some new kind of, new position. It's actually reclaiming and it's, going back to the tradition, going back to the Qur'an and really looking at it. And I think that is really important, that if you start at that point, often people are scared about change. And I mean, I'm not. And I think that's sometimes problematic, but actually in communities, if you go back to where people are at and where they are comfortable, that's a good starting point for the conversation. And at MWN UK, we've seen a shift in how people respond to some of the ideas that we propose. Initially, it was very kind of, no, that's completely outlandish. But when you position it within an Islamic framework, actually, within a rights-based framework, people are more likely to adopt it. And we saw this when we worked with imams on the issue of forced marriage in Muslim communities here in the UK. And we're on a platform essentially saying the same things. And that was really effective. And I do think, patience, I'm learning this the older I get. As activists, we want all the solutions right now because, we deserve the solutions right now. But sometimes societal change takes time. And I think challenging attitudes is a slow process. And we should be ready for not only the long fight, but also the slow transition. And I think the only way you challenge attitudes is by presenting alternatives. And on the helpline, this is what we do. When a woman contacts us about a particular issue, one of the questions we ask her is, did you know there's another interpretation to what you've just said to me? Something that you've believed your entire life, but actually there may be option 2, option 3, which are all, perfectly fine, to consider also. And I think that the presenting of alternative ideas is really key, because it also reminds us that, our tradition and our approach does not have to be rigid. It is dynamic and can be inclusive of many experiences too.
Thank you, Faeeza. Very important. The importance of the diversity and the richness of having multiple choices and alternatives. Now I have another question for Amira, which is a difficult question about Ihsan and verse 434, the famous verse on the concept of qawama. And so the question says that concerning marriage turbulence, how can we read the beating verse in terms of the Ihsan concept, or through the Ihsan concept? And there is a related question that I'm going to ask at the same time is, could you allude more to how concepts of Ihsan and Adl relate to gender dynamics in the Muslim household, particularly when explored in relations to qawama?
Yeah, thank you so much. Now, part of this question, I'm not qualified to really answer because I cannot say that I have investigated that verse fully, but I would refer to the person who's asking the question to look on the work of Qawama by Umayma Abu Bakr and to explore that under this kind of meta umbrella that I'm talking about. But I don't want to say something that I haven't really investigated myself, so I can't speak of that. But I can speak about how Ihsan and how it affects, relationships. And I think that we might need to bring in even more verses from the Quran about that. But I think it's just that deliberate effort to try to put forth whatever is more beautiful and whatever is good. And that can happen both at times when the marriage is okay. It doesn't mean that it only happens at turbulent times. I think the Quran emphasizes it at turbulent times because this is where the human tendency kind of tends to reach its lowest, moral platform. Is that when you are obviously decided that there's a divorce, you can no longer live with that person. In most cases, that's not the expectation. When you go into a marriage, you plan on being, together till death do us part. So there's a lot of anger, and it's at that point where you have to try to think about beauty and goodness. So in the case of marriage, whether it's a divorce situation or not, putting the other in that context, I think it goes both ways. On the one hand, for example, I would call upon the men, if there's a divorce situation and they are living in a country like the country I'm living in now, is where there is no, for example, shared property rules, and a couple has been married for 30 years and they've accrued wealth together and accrued whatever property. Now, I think it is incumbent upon the Muslim believer, if the man has the power and the law has not yet reached the level of, coming up with this type of law, that it is up to the man to take it upon himself, not to feel, entitled because he's not breaking any rules, then he gets to keep all of the wealth and treat his wife in a way that as if this is like charity if he, shares with her something. But no, to live up to the Quranic ideal and to share the wealth evenly, because this is what is more beautiful and what is more good. That actually is just what is just, maybe some people would argue that what is more beautiful and what is more good is to even give more. So I think it's incumbent upon men, but it's also incumbent upon women. I'm sure many of you have also heard of situations where in a case of the divorce, the woman tries to kind of get back at the husband through the children by denying him the rights to visit or see the children. And I think this is also goes against this notion of ihsan, that women also have a responsibility to put that out and to manifest it in a marriage, and to see it in terms of, even if there are situations that seem that are turbulent, and I'm not saying accept ugliness, but there's also a very important verse in the Quran that says, ادفع بالتي هي أحسن فإذا بالذي بينك وبينه عداوة فإنه ولي حميم. And what this means, and this is in Surah 41, is that when there is a situation of conflict, and here it's not talking about marriage necessarily, but human conflict, that when you are in that situation, your means of pushing back is not through greater, turbulence or more aggression, but it's actually as subduing this aggression by putting itfa, which means pushing or presenting forth what is more beautiful and what is more good. Now, why I'm making a very deliberate effort to not say what beauty and goodness necessarily are, because then I would be kind of strangling the definition. And the whole point is, the idea is that in every waking moment that we have, we are making decisions. We are making decisions of what action am I going to take next? How am I going to respond to a question that you are asking, or to a comment that someone is making, or to bullying on the internet, or to whatever it might be? And if someone comes and defines what beauty and goodness are, then you are taking that responsibility away from the individual. And I think what I am arguing is that we are incriminated, through this belief in the Quran, to take it upon ourselves to assess each situation individually and to think of what does ihsan mean in this particular point. At some point, it might mean that refrain from beating your sister, simply. For someone else, it might be something that's much more elevated than that. So there's a difference between people, and upon our own scale as individuals, what I can do to manifest beauty and goodness today, I might be able to do much more tomorrow. So even within our own level, we have to kind of always allow room for growth and to keep moving up that ladder and trying to make choices that, at least as far as our conscience is concerned, we believe that it has put forth what is more beautiful and what is more good.
Thank you.
Sarah, if you don't mind, I want to add to that my approach would be to also challenge the ugly. So I think in finding the beauty, challenging the ugly, and not putting up with the ugly is also, for me, an active form of ihsan.
Yeah, and thank you, Faeeza.
Yeah, there's no such thing really as innocent bystander. If you accept ugliness around you, then you're partly incriminated in that. And I think part of the role is to definitely, I agree with Faeeza, is to repel the ugly.
Yeah, and it's also part of the culture, how do we challenge this concept of shame, of being patient with the ugliness, of bearing the violence. So there is this proactive sense of saying, no, actually, it's our right. It's our individual right to say, no, I want to live a beautiful and fair life. So it's very, very important and powerful stance.
I think Amira's point about everyone knows their capacity and what they can do. Yeah. But I would challenge not only ourselves, but the audience to really consider, well, what can you do? Find that thing that you can do and do it. Take an action.
Exactly. And this leads us to actually one last question that I would like to address to both of you. We had a lot of very important and insightful questions, but time is short. So I'm gonna make the choice to ask you this last question to both of you and end with that. But I want to remind the audience that if some of your questions were not addressed, to follow up on that with us via email, and we can follow up with Amira and Faeeza and get back to you. So this question is about the reframing and analysis of Ihsan as an active, intentional daily practice, which is transformational because it enables us to be fallible, yet continue to try again. How can we embed this in social justice work? So the person says, I can see how we can use this conception both in an individual, but also as a social context or practice. Do you know if there are any resources where this is realized? And if not, shall we create something, a model, a practice?
Go ahead.
Yeah, because mine is probably more theoretical. You're much more on the grounds, and that is so much harder. I think that, again, creating this dominant discourse by bringing beauty to the forefront, by asking everyone to prioritize and consider beauty a central element. So when you, as just like Faeeza said, when you see a situation where there is ugliness, speak up. Do not, be quiet. I was walking down the street yesterday and I found a young guy cursing this other guy in the loudest way, and they thought that was fun. And I went to him and I was very polite and very nice, and I asked him, can I ask you a question? And he said, yeah. And I said, do you ever think that when you say that you might be hurting me? That I don't really want to hear that when I'm walking down the street? And he just looked at me for a second and he said, I'm sorry. Very simple things. And I'm not, this obviously we are talking about situations that are very, very grave, but I'm saying it's at that very little effort, surrounding yourself with beauty. When you sit, ensure that what your surroundings look like, the way you speak, the way you answer, an inquiry or a call. I think that we have to keep manifesting it until it becomes, we start seeing the connections. When I say it and you say it and Musawah says it and more people say it, then it becomes kind of the fallback option and we start elevating. And I realize how difficult that is. And it is kind of a meta thing, but we're talking about divine guidance. So we need to really shoot for the stars. We need to aim for the stars. We might not, catch one, but it's very different than also, digging in the dirt. And I think that we have to kind of do both, keep elevating.
I mean, the only thing I would add is providing alternatives. I think having alternative references and points is super important for moving us away from unconsciousness in terms of our faith. And to move us to a position where we are conscious and active and taking responsibility, as Amira said. So for me, that's important. And that's why Musawah's work is so important.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Faeeza. Thank you, Amira, for really very, very important insights. A groundbreaking research, Amira. We're all looking forward to reading your paper and to putting that into action. And thank you, Faeeza, for bringing that to the lived realities on the ground and sharing with us the very important work you're doing enabling us to actually put all these ideals and theoretical concept into action. So again, I just want to remind our listeners to please follow up with us via email if you had any questions that were not answered or any feedback that you would like to share with us and our speakers. And we really apologize that because we wish we had another 1 hour to have this very important, fascinating conversation with our speakers and with all of you. Now I will have to conclude with some synthesis or concluding points. So you left us with many important things to reflect on, Amira and Faeeza, and also through the questions that were sent. One is that there is a need to move from this atomistic Quranic reading to a holistic one that look at the Quran overarching ethical worldview. And this is something that we will discuss further in our upcoming webinar with Umayma Abu Bakr, Asma al-Mrabet, and Mulki al-Sharmani. So I invite also our listeners to join and register for this webinar, inshallah, which will be next week. The second point is that whenever we look at the Quran to analyze and study what it has to say about gender and family relation, we tend to be stuck with the difficult verses. And this also was reflected through the questions we had on verse 434. And so we're stuck with this concept of obedience, of authority, of punishment. And this is also a result of this atomistic reading of the verses. In this ethical worldview, Amira, you focused on ihsan, husn, its derivative. You've also showed that it has evolving meanings depending on the places, the times, and the fact that there isn't a strict, rigid definition of ihsan is actually powerful, because if it had only one definition, it would restrict and confine its potential and relevance. You've also highlighted the gaps in early exegetical work that failed to look at the comprehensive meaning of ihsan, and as a result, were constrained by their patriarchal gaze. Then there is this key relationship between ihsan and adl, and something that Faeeza also touched upon, between beauty, goodness, and justice, because pursuing ihsan is only possible after securing justice, securing adl. And that's why the Quran mandates ihsan in times of difficulty, in times of unequal power dynamics. And you've mentioned the example of verses related to divorce, related to relationship to parents, and other challenging family relations. Then there is this beautiful modelization of ihsan in concentric circles. And you've shown that in this modelization, family is the founding block. It is from there that ihsan radiates to the world. So taking us back to the work we're doing also in Musawah, it's so important to advocate for equality and justice within our families, because this is how then it channels back to the rest of the society. And with Faeeza and our participants' comments and questions, we've touched upon the disconnect, the discrepancy between what seemed to be an ideal and the reality on the ground. And that's why it's important to translate this very important study that Amira is doing into action, into practical steps, to take our family norms out of the ethics of fear and move them into the ethics of love, the ethics of beauty. And in all this, we need to be humble, because we know change won't happen immediately, but it's a process. And your research, Amira, your work, Faeeza, and all of you who are with us today in these conversations, you are all part of this process. We're all planting the seeds for our future generations and for changing the paradigm and the discourse. Amira, we're looking forward to your paper to come out. I want to remind our listeners to just keep in touch with us through our website, and also to look at the future webinars who will feature the other authors in the research initiative. Thank you, Amira. Thank you, Faeeza. Now we will close, but please don't leave yet, because I will hand over to my colleague, Jana, who will launch a quick poll and say a foreword before ending. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. So we can now launch a quick survey. Please take the time. It's just 2 questions. And we want you to answer these questions so we can better understand how you experience this webinar, and so we can plan for future webinars in this series. And we have a few more coming up, and we really hope you can join us for that. So while you're taking the survey, I just want to give a huge thank you to Amira, to Faeeza, to Sarah, and to all of the Musawah team behind the scenes, especially Alex, Rasha, Zul, and the KB working group members, Ziba and Mulki. And thank you to everyone who came today and tuned in and engaged in this webinar. And I'm just so inspired by this conversation and the reminder that beauty and goodness are what we really need right now during these times. We want to share again that we'll be having a webinar in another 9 days on January 22nd, and it will feature the work of Umayma Abu Bakr, Asma al-Mrabet, and Mulki al-Sharmani on Quranic ethics of marriage. And this is a focus on how marriage and gender relations are constructed within the Quran, and the ethical worldview of the Quran, and the implications of this kind of reading for gender norms and for rights. So we'll just sit tight for a minute while we wait for everyone to finish the survey, and just enjoy a little bit more warmth and good spirits from our session today. And don't forget to check Musawah's website and social media for more resources and material. Thank you, everyone, and all the best to you.
And thank you, Jana, for sharing all these important resources on the chat and helping with clustering the questions.
Thank you guys very much. And thank you, Sarah, for this brilliant synthesis, and Faeeza for being here and showing us that how life is on the ground and how lived reality is and how we could focus on that. And if I may just end, reminding people that there is a verse in the Quran that says, "Hal jaza'ul ihsani illa al-ihsan." So all we have to do as individuals is put that out there and do with this universal harmony. It comes back. It comes back at the individual level, and I'm sure it comes back at the collective level. Thank you so much. I'm really humbled to have been here with you guys.
Thank you, Amira. It's really a blessing, alhamdulillah.